The Moscow army has lost about 100,000 of its soldiers since the beginning of the Ukrainian war. Among these losses of Russia were very special troops. A large part of these elite military units of the Russians, whose training amounted to billions of dollars, were completely erased from history due to the Ukrainian war. Dozens of elite paratroopers, special forces units, operationally high-skilled Russian soldiers belonging to the Russian army were eliminated by the Ukrainian army. Since the Moscow administration lost these elite units, it lost its military superiority, which it had achieved at the beginning of the war to Ukraine. Then Zelensky's army cleverly used this advantage to support the training and needs of its troops, and continue to focus on attacks against elite squads of invading Russian soldiers. One of the most distinguished and well-known units of the Russian army was the 1st Guards Elite Tank Army. The 1st Guards Elite Tank Army was one of the strongest units of the Russian ground forces. The army's history dates back to the 1st Tank Army, which was formed twice in July 1942 and January 1943, and was transformed into the 1st Guards Tank Army in January 1994. This special unit fought as part of the Red Army on the Eastern Front during World War II. The army was commanded by Mikhail Katukov for most of the war. Following the end of the Cold War and the consequent withdrawal of Soviet troops from Germany, the elite Russian tank unit moved to Smolensk and was disbanded in 1999. The Russian elite 1st Guards Tank Army was reorganized in 2014 as part of Russia's military expansion. This renewed special unit fought in the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022, and still this unit continues to suffer heavy losses on the battlefield after its withdrawal from the northeast of Ukraine, and then from Kharkiv. With so many losses, this elite unit is crippled, and Russia's latest decision has taken a heavy toll on the agenda. After the Russian 1st Guards Tank Army suffered heavy losses in the Kharkiv and Donbas regions, Vladimir Putin had to use mobilized recruits to make up for the elite unit's shortcomings. Almost 95% of the Russian 1st Guards Tank Army was destroyed during the Ukrainian army's attacks on Kharkiv. Therefore, Russia had to add troops to the special unit. The latest war-related intelligence report of the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense pointed out that Russia's once very powerful 1st Guards Tank Army is full of new mobilized soldiers. Heavy losses in Ukraine cast doubt on the ability of the 1st Russian Guards Army to fight the advance of the Kiev forces, with the unit tasked with holding the front line in the Luhansk region. This elite Russian tank unit is known to have massive troops and armored vehicles. The Russian 1st Guards Tank Army is believed to have at least 25,000 troops and more than 500 tanks and other armored vehicles supporting them, although their exact numbers are kept secret. Of course, this presence did not frighten the Ukrainians at all, and if you remember, almost half of the 1st Russian Tank Army was destroyed by Ukrainian artillery in the Battle of Severodonetsk in June. Although the Russian elite army was well below its authorized strength of 25,000, it was partially reinforced by mobilized reserves. But the Moscow administration and the Russian leaders' methods in this regard will greatly reduce the quality of the elite Russian tank army. Currently, the number of such elite units in Russia is considerably reduced, particularly the disintegration of such elite Russian troops or their elimination by Ukrainian forces causes the Moscow administration to fall into a completely ineffective position in the war. Russia's 1st Guards Elite Tank Corps is the best example of this. The fact that the soldiers that Putin included in the Russian army with his decision to mobilize join this elite tank unit is actually seen as a compensation for a great deficiency in terms of the Moscow administration. However, in the future, this step of the Russian administration is considered as a harbinger of increasing the losses of the 1st Guards Elite Tank Unit even more. The reason for this is shown as the soldiers that Putin included in the Russian army with a mobilization decision will not be able to adapt in any way to this special unit. Russian soldiers who are mobilized because they are untrained in warfare are unlikely to succeed in the missions of this special unit. Even now, the influence of the Russian Special Tank Unit tends to fade. Also, this step of the Russian administration seems to lead to the complete destruction of the elite Russian tank unit. A statement came from Ukraine regarding the current position of this special unit, which is still active in the war. In the briefing of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine, it was noted that elements of Russia's First Guards Tank Army were deployed, possibly along the defensive line near Luhansk Oblast town of Svatove, after massive losses. It is known that the Russian First Guard Elite Tank Army suffered heavy losses during the retreat from the Kharkiv region in September 2022 and at the beginning of the war. The current situation of the Special Russian Tank Unit is pretty bad, and with each passing day, the Russian First Guard Elite Tank Unit is almost going into the collapse phase. The losses of this unit to date have changed the critical balance of the Ukraine-Russia war. Especially in the last period, these important losses in a few months of the war played a role in the ineffectiveness of the Russian elite tank unit. In addition, the Special Russian Unit, believed to consist of at least 500 tanks and other war vehicles, suffered heavy losses in the conflicts around Kharkiv before the war started. According to a Russian casualty diary released by the Ukrainian Military Intelligence Unit, the First Guard Elite Tank Unit lost 131 tanks and 409 soldiers in the first 19 days of the war alone. The loss of these elite units of Russia made the work of the Ukrainian army much easier in a way. At the beginning of the war, the Russians' control of a large part of the Ukrainian lands, thanks to these elite soldiers, limited the area of decision-making and control powers of the Kiev administration on operational issues. But over time, the critical steps and extraordinary resistance plans of the Ukrainian armed forces, combined with the epic operations of the Kiev soldiers, changed the course of the war. When we look at the current state of the war, we realize that the successful efforts of the Ukrainian army, which we have mentioned, quickly reduced the influence of the Russians in the Kharkiv, Kherson, and even Donbas regions. Meanwhile, the Institute for the Study of War, a US-based military think tank, has published an extremely detailed report on the status of Russia's military campaign to take over the entire Donbas region. ISW analysts noted that Russian-hired gunfights for the Wagner Group offered desperate resistance south of the city of Bakhmut as the Ukrainian army counterattacked along the front line and attempted to retake lost positions. The published report widely claimed that the Wagner Group fighters had taken control of Yakovlivka and that fierce fighting was taking place in Opydne, Klitschivka, and Soledar near Bakhmut. The Russian Ministry of Defense announced that the Ukrainian troops failed in an attempt to regain some of the lost positions south of Bakhmut. The reports of the Russian ministry largely discussed the intensity of operations in this region and drew attention to the high casualties of Ukraine. In the reports of the Russian ministry officials, it was also mentioned that the Russian forces continued their ground attacks around Bakhmut. The Ukrainian General Staff reported that the Kiev troops repelled the Russian attacks on Verkhokamyanska, Spirne, Yakovlivka, located northeast of Bakhmut, and Bakhmut near these areas. The attacks of the invading troops in Bilahora and Kurdyumivka regions, 15 kilometers southwest of Bakhmut, were also prevented by the soldiers of the Ukrainian army. Meanwhile, Putin had to admit that the Ukraine-Russia war, which he called a special military operation, was taking longer than expected to achieve its goals. In a speech about this issue broadcast on Russian state television, leader Vladimir Putin said, "This special military operation can, of course, be a long process." Putin failed to acknowledge many of the military failures his forces had suffered in recent weeks, such as the loss of the city of Kherson to Ukrainian troops. Instead, the Russian leader sought to point out that the Kremlin's land grabs were an important consequence for Russia. Vladimir Putin also emphasized the importance of the Sea of Azov. In one of his frequent historical references to a Russian leader he admires, Putin added that Peter the Great fought to gain access to that body of water located between southeastern Ukraine and southwestern Russia, claiming that Russia is in a much better position in this war. How long will Vladimir Putin try to convince both himself and the Russian people of this lie? In the following processes, we will be here again with the answers to all the curious questions and new developments about the war. Please don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Thank you for watching us.